Dear sir, as an example of the patience and long-suffering of God, the power of His grace in softening the hardest heart, and the riches of His mercy in pardoning the most enormous and aggravated transgressions, I know no example, no case more extraordinary than my own. And indeed, many persons to whom I have related my story have thought it worthy of being preserved. As you and others of my friends are pleased to desire more detail, I am willing to obey. We set sail for home about the beginning of January 1748. From Africa to England, without touching any intermediate port, is perhaps more than 7,000 miles if we allow for the circuit necessary on account of the trade winds. The ship, the Greyhound, was greatly out of repair and very, very unsuited for stormy weather. The sails were worn out, and many such circumstances combined to render what followed more dangerous. Among the few books on board, there was a copy of George Stanhope's translation of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. Now, the day before the catastrophe, I casually took it up to pass away the time. While I was reading, an involuntary suggestion arose in my mind. What if these things should be true? I couldn't bear the idea and shut the book, bringing an abrupt stop to these speculations. I went to bed that night with my usual sense of security and indifference, but was awaked from a sound sleep by the force of a violent sea. So much of it came down below that it filled my cabin with water. This alarm was followed by a cry from the deck that the ship was sinking. I began to go up on deck, but was met on the ladder by the captain, who asked me to bring a knife. While I was returning for the knife, another person went up in my place and was instantly washed overboard. We had not time to lament him, nor did we imagine that we ourselves would survive him long. The sea had torn away the upper timbers on one side and had made the ship a mere wreck in a matter of minutes. We immediately manned the pumps, and in spite of all our efforts, the water rose. Some of us were set to bailing with buckets and pails. Yet, nevertheless, the ship was full of water, very, very nearly so. Had we a common cargo, the ship would surely have sunk, of course. But we had a great quantity of beeswax and wood on board, which were lighter than the water. We used most of our clothes and bedding to stop the leaks, and nailed bits of wood over the top. At last, we saw the water abate. Now, at the beginning, I worked hard at the pumps and tried to encourage myself and my companion by, I told him that in a few days' time we would talk about this distress over a glass of wine. But he replied with tears, No, it is too late now. At about 9 o'clock, exhausted from cold and labour, I went to talk with the captain, and when I was returning, I found myself saying, almost without thinking, if all this labour will not suffice, then may the Lord have mercy on us. This was the first desire for mercy that I had breathed in many years. I was instantly struck by my own words, and then immediately thought, what mercy can there be from thee? I returned to the pumps until noon. Every passing wave, or almost every passing wave, breaking over my head. Each time the vessel descended into the sea, I thought that she would arise no more. And though I dreaded death now, I remained in a mixture of despair and impatience. You see, I thought that if the Christian religion were true, I could not be forgiven. And so I was expecting and almost wishing to know the worst of it. When I could do no more, I lay down on my bed, not certain if I should arise again. Nevertheless, after an hour I was called, and not being able to work at the pumps, I went to the helm, where I steered the ship until midnight. Here, I had the opportunity for reflection. I thought, oh dear, I thought that there never was, nor could be, such a sinner as myself, and concluded at first that my sins were too great to be forgiven. I had once been very, very well acquainted with the Bible, my mother having taught me as a child, and many passages on this occasion returned to my memory. Now, when I saw that against all probability there still might be some respite, and when at about 6 in the evening I heard that the ship was clear of water, there arose for me a gleam of hope. I thought I saw the hand of God displayed in our favour. I began to pray and to think of this Jesus whom I had so often derided. I recollected particulars of his life and death, a death for sins not his own, but as I remembered, for the sake of those who, in their distress, should put their trust in him. The great question now was how I should gain assurance that the scriptures were true. We began to recover, and yet we were still greatly alarmed by our circumstances. All our provisions were saved, but the sails were mostly blown away, and so we could only advance very slowly. We imagined ourselves to be 100 leagues from land, but we were in reality much, much further than that. And so we proceeded with alternate hope and fear. Most of my leisure time now was spent in reading and meditating upon the scriptures and praying to the Lord for mercy and instruction. The weather remained fair for about 4 or 5 days, and then gales sprang up from the southeast and continued against us for over a fortnight after. The ship was now so wrecked that we were obliged to keep the wind always to the broken side, and thus we were propelled even further from our port. Our provisions were now fast growing into short supply, and we had incessant labour at the pumps just to keep the ship above water. Much labour and little food wasted us fast, and one man died under the hardship. Yet our sufferings were light in comparison with our fears. Our expectations grew darker every day. And I had a further trouble peculiar to myself. The captain, whose temper was quite soured by distress, reproached me hourly with being the sole cause of the calamity, calling me Jonah, and was persuaded that if I were thrown overboard, they would be preserved from death. At the time when we were ready to give up all for lost, and despair was working on every countenance, we saw the wind come about to just the point we wished it, and to blow so gently as our few remaining sails could bear. And we saw the island of Tory, and the next day anchored in Lough Swilly in Ireland. This was on the 8th day of April, just 4 weeks after the damage was sustained from the sea. When we arrived at this port, the very last of our victuals were boiling in the pot, and we had not come there 2 hours when the wind, which had seemed to be providentially restrained until we arrived at a place of safety, began to blow with great violence. If we had continued at sea that night, in our shattered and enfeebled condition, we must surely have sunk to the bottom. About this time, I began to know that there is a God who hears and answers prayer. I am, my dear sirs, your obliged and humble servant,